My name is Clara Meadows, and for as long as I can remember, my life has been a study in lines. As a junior architectural designer in the historic city of Cedar Haven, I spend my days engrossed in blueprints, tracing the clean, decisive lines that transform empty space into structure, into sanctuary. I love the logic of it, the way a sturdy foundation supports soaring aspirations. My own life, however, has felt more like a sketch erased and redrawn so many times the paper has grown thin, the original lines lost to a smudge of graphite and regret. At 25, I was living back in my childhood home, a grand but weary Victorian on a street lined with proud, old maple trees. From the outside, it was a portrait of established grace, the kind of house people in Cedar Haven admired. Inside, its bones ached with unspoken tensions. I'd moved back to save money while I navigated the notoriously lean years of my apprenticeship at Sterling and Finch, one of the city's most respected firms. The plan was simple, a financial stepping stone. But my older sister, Isabel, had moved back 6 months prior, and her presence had warped the very geometry of the house. Isabel, at 27, was a tempest of unfulfilled ambitions. She'd cycled through photography, jewelry making, and most recently, a vaguely defined career as a lifestyle influencer, each pursuit shedding glitter and debt before dissolving into apathy. She was beautiful, a Botticelli angel with a shadowed temper, and our parents orbited her like anxious moons. Her failures were framed as artistic sensitivity, her moods were storms we were all expected to weather. The conflict between us had started as a low hum of resentment, but in the close quarters of our old home, it had amplified into a grating, dangerous feedback loop. The soft, metallic tang of blood bloomed in my mouth, a stark contrast to the dusty, mildewed scent of the basement. I was sprawled at the foot of the narrow wooden stairs, a tangle of limbs and searing pain. Above me, silhouetted against the single, dim bulb of the landing, stood Isabel. Her hands were still slightly forward, as if she'd just released something she no longer wished to hold. Her face, usually a carefully curated mask of detached beauty for her online followers, was a raw canvas of fury and a chilling flicker of something else, vindication, perhaps. A moment later, the floorboards above groaned, and my parents' frantic footsteps pounded down the stairs. What in God's name happened? My mother's voice was a sharp crack in the silence, but her eyes, I noted with a familiar ache, went to Isabel first, not to me on the floor. She fell, Isabel said, her voice regaining its practiced, airy quality as she took a half-step back. She was carrying down a box of old books, and you know Clara. Always lost in her own head. So clumsy. I tried to form a denial, to tell them that I'd found her in the antique secretary in the parlor, prying the velvet lining from our great-grandmother's jewelry box. She'd been after the small sapphire pendant, the only thing of real value left. When I'd confronted her, her rage had been instantaneous and absolute. "You're always watching me, judging me," she'd shrieked, her voice a shard of glass. I had turned to leave, to find our parents, and she had shoved me, hard, between the shoulder blades, at the very top of the steep basement steps. But the air refused to enter my lungs properly. Each shallow, desperate gasp felt like a cluster of needles pressing into my side. I didn't fall, I managed to push the words out, the effort making black spots dance in my vision. She pushed me. "That's enough, Clara." My father's voice was a stonewall. He was a senior partner at Meadows, Thorne and Associates, a man for whom appearances were not just important, but the very bedrock of his existence. "We don't have time for your theatrics." My mother knelt beside me, her hands hovering uncertainly before helping me to sit up. I couldn't stifle a cry as a bolt of agony shot through my ribs. "Edward, I think we need to get her to the hospital," Mom said, a rare note of genuine worry threading through her voice. "No hospitals," Dad said, his tone final. He glanced up the stairs as if the neighbors could hear through the thick stone foundation. "We'll manage this. It's a sprain. We always manage. We always manage." The words echoed in the damp air, a ghostly refrain from a long and sorrowful song. They were the words used to bandage a sprained wrist when Isabel had hurled a heavy art history book at me for using her special watercolor paper. They were the words used to soothe a concussion when she'd slammed the pantry door into my face in a fit of pique. Each incident was meticulously reframed, my pain minimized, my role in provoking her silently implied. My clumsiness, my sensitivity, my timing, all were offered up as explanations to protect the fragile portrait of our perfect family. But this was different. The pain wasn't a dull ache, it was a sharp, brilliant, undeniable thing. It was a structural failure, and I could feel the supporting beams of my own body giving way. "She needs a doctor, Edward," my mother insisted, her hand now resting on my shoulder, feeling the tremors that racked my body. "Fine," he snapped, the word cracking like a whip. He turned his gaze on me, his eyes cold and commanding. "But you know the story, Clara. You were carrying a heavy box. You lost your footing. It was a simple accident. Are we clear?" Behind him, I saw Isabel's lips curve into a faint, triumphant smirk. She was safe. The golden child, the volatile artist, could do no wrong. Her violence was a passing weather pattern. My injuries were the unfortunate consequence of standing in the rain. The emergency room at Cedar Haven General was a symphony of controlled chaos. Beeps, hushed conversations, the squeak of rubber soles on polished linoleum. As we waited, my father stood beside my gurney, his hand on the rail, rehearsing my lines in a low, insistent murmur. "You were organizing the basement, you remember? You tripped on the last step." A simple, believable story. I nodded, the lie already forming a bitter paste on my tongue. I felt detached, floating above myself, watching a scene unfold that I'd been in 100 times before. But the protagonist of this play was usually a child with a scraped knee, not a 25-year-old woman with a suspected internal injury. The doctor who finally pulled back the curtain on my cubicle was not our family physician, a man who had long ago learned to accept my parents' carefully edited narratives. Her name tag read Dr. Anya Sharma. She had warm, intelligent eyes that seemed to see more than the superficial facts presented to her. She moved with a gentle efficiency, her presence a pocket of calm in the ER's storm. She looked directly at me, a subtle but significant departure from the norm. Most doctors addressed my parents. "So, Clara, can you tell me what happened?" she asked, her voice soft. I fell down the stairs, I recited, the words hollow and foreign. "I was carrying a box and I missed a step." Dr. Sharma's gaze didn't waver. Her eyes, a deep, thoughtful brown, narrowed just a fraction. She glanced at my father, who was nodding encouragingly, then at my mother, who was twisting the strap of her purse, and finally at Isabel, who was affecting an air of tragic concern. Then her eyes returned to me. "I'd like to examine you privately, if you don't mind," she said, her tone polite but unmistakably firm. "That won't be necessary," my father began, stepping forward. "We're here to support her." Dr. Sharma held up a hand. "It's standard hospital policy in cases with potential trauma, especially a fall like this. It allows the patient to speak freely without feeling pressured. Please, wait in the family waiting area just outside. A nurse will be with you shortly." Her authority was quiet, but absolute. My father, accustomed to being the one in charge, looked momentarily stunned, but then acquiesced with a tight nod. As they filed out, Isabel shot me a look that was a cocktail of warning and resentment. Once the curtain was drawn, the space felt different. Quieter. Safer. Dr. Sharma helped me sit up on the examination table, her touch gentle and professional. The room was sterile and impersonal, but her focused attention made it feel like a sanctuary. "All right, Clara," she said, her voice even softer now. "Let's try this again. Why don't you tell me what really happened?" Something in her direct, compassionate gaze tugged at a deeply buried part of me, the part that longed to tell the truth. But years of conditioning, of protecting the family's fragile peace, were a powerful restraint. The well-worn grooves of denial were too deep. "I told you." I fell. "Clara," she said, pulling a small stool over to sit near the table, so she was at my eye level. "I have been an ER doctor for nearly 15 years. I know what injuries from a simple fall down a flight of stairs typically look like. They're chaotic. Scrapes here, a bruise there." She gently took my arm, her fingers tracing the faint, mottled bruises on my bicep, a completely different color from the angry new contusions. These, however, are older. And these here, she pointed to my forearm, look like grip marks. Distinct. As if someone held you tightly before or during. Tears I hadn't even realized were forming pricked the backs of my eyes and began to spill, hot and silent, down my temples. I turned my head away, but I didn't speak. The silence was my last remaining shield. Dr. Sharma didn't push. She simply nodded, as if my tears were a language she understood perfectly well. Okay, let's get you down for some x-rays, she said, standing. We need to see what's going on with your ribs. Then we can talk more. The x-ray room was cold and dark. As I held my breath for the images, I felt a strange sense of surrender. For the first time, my body was going to tell its own story, in a language of shadow and light that couldn't be coached or manipulated. When Dr. Sharma returned with the films, her expression was grave. She clipped them onto the light box, and the fluorescent glare illuminated the ghostly architecture of my own bones. Well, you were right to come in, she said. You have 3 fractured ribs on your left side, and a hairline fracture here in your right wrist. But that wasn't what held her attention. That wasn't what had drawn that deep line of concern between her brows. She pointed to other areas on the x-ray of my torso, to faint, web-like lines on other ribs. Clara, these are old injuries, she said, her voice low and serious. Healed fractures. This one here and this one. They've calcified. You may never have even known about them, mistaken them for deep bruises that took a long time to heal. But these x-rays, they tell a story. And it's not a story about clumsiness. I stared at the images, at the undeniable evidence of past traumas etched into my own skeleton. The time Isabel had accidentally knocked me into the edge of the grand piano. The time I'd slipped on the icy porch after an argument. Each event had been an isolated incident, a single, unfortunate data point. But here, laid out in stark black and white, they formed a pattern. A history. As a physician, Dr. Sharma continued, her voice gentle but firm, I am a mandated reporter. When I see a clear pattern of injury that suggests sustained abuse, I have a legal and ethical obligation to report it. My heart hammered against my broken ribs. No, please, I whispered, the old instinct to protect, to smooth things over, flaring up. You don't understand. My family. Your family, she interrupted, her eyes full of a sad understanding, has been enabling this. These injuries, the pattern they show, it goes back years. Clara, you're an architectural designer. You understand structure. You're looking at the evidence of a structure that has been repeatedly damaged and improperly repaired. This isn't about one fall. This is about the foundation being compromised. She was right. Seeing my own body through the objective lens of the X-ray, using the part of my brain that analyzed stress points and structural integrity, I could finally see the truth I had so diligently helped to hide. The pattern was undeniable. The evidence was irrefutable. I need to make a couple of phone calls, Dr. Sharma said, her hand resting on my shoulder for a brief, reassuring moment. You are safe here. We'll have hospital security posted outside your room. Your family cannot take you home against medical advice. As she slipped out of the cubicle, I could hear my father's voice rising in the hallway, demanding to know what was taking so long, his words laced with the familiar edge of impatience and control. But for the very first time in my life, the sound of his anger didn't fill me with a cold dread. It filled me with a fragile, fluttering sense of hope. The X-rays had spoken the truth I never could. And someone was finally listening. The next few hours were a strange, suspended reality. A uniformed security guard stood quietly outside my curtained-off space, a calm and solid presence that felt more protective than my own family ever had. In the corridor, the family drama played out in hushed, urgent tones. I could hear my father's blustering indignation as he spoke to a hospital administrator, my mother's tearful, placating murmurs, and Isabel's theatrical sobs about how I was twisting everything, how I was trying to ruin her life out of jealousy. But their words felt like static, their power to shape my reality fading against the stark evidence illuminated on the light box. The X-rays couldn't lie. Dr. Sharma had brought in a colleague, a gentle, older physician named Dr. Evans, who specialized in documenting trauma cases. Together, they sat with me, pointing out the silent testimony of my bones. "These hairline fractures on your forearms," Dr. Evans explained, his voice kind. "These are classic defensive injuries. The kind a person sustains when they raise their arms to protect their head or torso from a blow, or to brace for a fall they know is coming." My hands trembled as I looked at the images, seeing my own history laid bare. Years of instinctively protecting myself, of absorbing impacts, of treating my body like a shield. How had I let them convince me it was all just a series of unfortunate accidents? How had I participated in the construction of my own cage? A police detective arrived soon after. His name was Detective Miles, a man with tired, patient eyes and a quiet, no-nonsense demeanor that I found immensely reassuring. He didn't treat me like a victim or a child. He treated me like a credible witness. "Take your time," he said, placing a small digital recorder on the rolling table beside my bed. "Just start from whenever feels like the beginning." And so I did. With the hum of the hospital as my backdrop, I started to build a new structure, this one made of words. I told him about growing up in Isabel's shadow, about how the accidents began small, a shove on the playground, a playful trip on the stairs, and were always smoothed over by our parents. I spoke of their desperate need to maintain the pristine facade of the Meadows family of Cedar Haven, a family whose name was on a wing of the local museum and whose holiday parties were legendary. I explained how the abuse had escalated as we grew older, subtler in some ways, more violent in others, until I was living in a state of constant, low-grade fear in the very house that was meant to be my home. "Why didn't you leave?" Detective Miles asked, not with judgment, but with a genuine desire to understand. "My apprenticeship," I explained, my voice raspy. "The pay is barely enough to cover my student loans and transportation. Living at home was the only way I could make it work. And a part of me kept thinking it was my fault. That if I were just quieter or more accommodating or less present, somehow it would stop." "That's what they needed you to believe," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "It's easier to control someone who believes they are the source of the problem. You are not responsible for their choices, Clara." A soft knock on the doorframe preceded Dr. Sharma's return. She was holding another file. "Clara, the radiologist found something else on the CT scan we did of your head, just to be safe," she said. "There's evidence of a prior concussion, one that likely didn't receive proper medical attention. There's some residual scarring." My breath caught. "About 4 months ago," I whispered, the memory surfacing, sharp and clear. "I wouldn't lend Isabel my car." She threw a heavy ceramic vase at me. It missed, but it hit the wall behind me, and I fell and hit my head on my desk. "My mother said I just had a bad headache and needed to sleep it off." Detective Miles's pen scratched steadily against his notepad. "We'll need to document that as well." Suddenly, a commotion erupted in the hallway. Isabel's voice, high and piercing, cut through the relative quiet. "You can't keep me away from my own sister. This is insane. Clara, tell them. Tell them this is all a misunderstanding." The security guard stood firm as Isabel tried to push her way into my room. Our eyes met through the gap in the curtain. For the first time in my life, I saw raw, undiluted fear in her eyes. The game was up. The rules had changed. The X-rays were an impartial, unimpeachable witness, and their testimony exposed every lie, every carefully constructed alibi. My parents could no longer plaster over the cracks with talk of my clumsiness or accusations of my being dramatic. "Miss Meadows," Detective Miles called out, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable weight of authority. "I suggest you step back. You're interfering with a police investigation, and I can add that to the list of potential charges." Isabel's face crumpled. It wasn't the performative distress she'd shown earlier, it was the bewildered collapse of someone whose power had just evaporated. "But I didn't mean." She looked desperately toward our parents for rescue, but they were entangled in their own unraveling. My father was locked in a tense, low-voiced argument with the hospital administrator, while my mother sat slumped in a waiting room chair, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent, belated sobs. Dr. Sharma sat on the edge of my bed, her presence a silent affirmation. "We're going to admit you overnight for observation, Clara," she said. "Mainly for the concussion and to manage the pain from your ribs. We're also arranging for a social worker to come speak with you in the morning to discuss your options." "What happens now?" I asked, my gaze shifting between the doctor and the detective. "Now," Detective Miles said, closing his notebook, "we build a case. The X-rays provide objective, physical evidence of a long-term pattern of abuse. That, combined with your statement and the hospital's official documentation, gives the district attorney's office a very strong foundation to proceed with charges." "Charges?" The word felt unreal, like something from a television show. "Against your sister for assault," he clarified. "And potentially against your parents for child endangerment when you were a minor, and for their role in concealing a crime and failing to protect you as an adult living in their home. They had a duty of care." It felt like watching a building I had lived in my entire life be condemned. It was terrifying, but it was also liberating. For years, I had been convinced that I had no voice, no proof, no way out. Now, because one doctor had trusted her instincts over a convenient lie, the entire faulty structure was coming down. "You don't have to figure everything out tonight," Dr. Sharma reassured me, seeing the overwhelmed look on my face. "The most important thing right now is for you to rest and begin to heal. We can help you find a place at a women's shelter when you're discharged, somewhere safe." A thought, clear and bright, cut through the fog. "I have a friend," I said, the name a comfort on my lips. "Lena. My best friend from university. She's been telling me for years that her spare room is mine if I ever need it." Detective Miles nodded, a look of relief on his face. "That's good. A strong support system is crucial." As they left, the sounds from the hallway seemed distant and muffled. My family's panic was no longer my own. The X-rays had done more than reveal broken bones. They had given me a foundation of truth to stand on. Proof that I wasn't crazy. Proof that I wasn't clumsy. Proof that could not be painted over, explained away, or hidden in the basement. I reached for my phone, my fingers clumsy from a mix of pain and adrenaline. I pulled up Lena's contact. "Remember that spare bedroom you're always offering?" I typed. "Is the offer still good?" Her reply came back almost instantly. "Always. For as long as you need it." "What's going on, Clara? Are you okay?" I looked over at the light box, where the image of my own fractured ribs still glowed, a map of my silent history. "It's a long story," I typed back. "But I'm finally building my own exit." 6 months later, the morning light streamed into the small, cheerful kitchen of Lena's apartment, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. I was grinding coffee beans, the rich, earthy scented daily ritual that grounded me in my new reality. On the small wooden table, an article on a local news website was open on my laptop. The headline was discreet: "Local artist receives probation, mandated counseling in family assault case." Isabel had accepted a plea bargain, 2 years of probation, court-mandated intensive therapy for anger management and personality disorders, and a restraining order that required her to stay at least 500 feet away from me at all times. My parents had faced their own quiet reckoning. The scandal had been a tremor through the foundations of their carefully constructed social world. My father had quietly retired early from his law firm, the partnership dissolved by mutual agreement. My mother had resigned from her position on the board of the Cedar Haven Arts Council. They had also accepted a plea deal on lesser charges of obstruction, resulting in probation, community service, and their own mandatory family counseling. The beautiful Victorian house on the Maple Line Street was for sale. "You okay?" Lena asked, walking into the kitchen and pouring herself a mug of the coffee I'd just brewed. She had been my unwavering support, the architect of my rescue. She had helped me move my things, screened calls from my parents, and sat with me through long nights when the ghosts of my past were too loud to sleep through. "Yeah," I said, and the word felt true solid. "I am." My phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Sharma. Over the months, she had become a mentor, a guiding voice as I navigated both my healing and my career. "Ready for the big day? So proud of you." Today, I was giving a guest lecture to a graduate class at the Cedar Haven School of Architecture. The title of my talk was "The Architecture of Safety: How Our Built Environments Shape Psychological Well-Being." With the university's permission, and with my identity as the subject kept anonymous to the students, I would be using my own X-rays as a central metaphor. You know, Lena said, watching me gather my notes and laptop into my bag, I'm incredibly proud of you. Not just for getting out, but for this. For turning the rubble into a blueprint for something better. She was right. In the months since that night in the ER, I had found a new kind of voice. I had poured my experiences into my work, designing with a newfound sensitivity to how light, space, and structure can create feelings of security or vulnerability. At Sterling and Finch, my boss, initially just impressed by my technical skills, now saw a depth in my work that hadn't been there before. I was no longer just designing buildings, I was designing sanctuaries. As I left the apartment, I saw Isabel. It wasn't an accident. She was standing across the street, near the park, well outside the 500-foot boundary of the restraining order. She must have known my new address, my new routine. "Clara," she called out, her voice tentative, stripped of its old, sharp edges. "Please, can we just talk for a minute?" I stopped, my hand tightening on the strap of my bag. I looked at my sister, truly looked at her. The defiant, glamorous mask was gone. She looked smaller, tired. I'd heard through a mutual acquaintance that she was taking her therapy seriously, that she was finally confronting the demons that had driven her to torment me. "I can't, Isabel," I said, my voice firm but not unkind. "You know I can't." "The order." I know," she said quickly, holding up her hands as if to prove she wouldn't come any closer. I received your letter. I had written it a month ago, a final assignment from my own therapist. It wasn't a letter of forgiveness, I wasn't there yet and maybe never would be. It was a letter of acknowledgement. It acknowledged our shared, broken history and my hope that she would find a way to build a better life for herself, one that didn't require tearing mine down. "I'm sorry," she said, and her voice cracked. A genuine, painful sound. I know those words they're not enough. They're nothing. But I am. The therapy it's helping me see. The ugliness. What I did. How much I must have hurt you. "I'm glad you're getting help," I said, and I meant it. Her healing was her own journey, but it was a relief to know it had at least begun. "But I need you to respect this space, Isabel." "My space." She nodded, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. "I will. I wanted you to know. What you did, it was brave. You were always the brave one, Clara. I think I hated you for it." As she turned and walked away, a weight I didn't even know I was still carrying seemed to dissolve from my shoulders. Her apology didn't erase the scars, but it validated a truth I was only just beginning to accept for myself. I was not weak. My quiet endurance had been a form of strength I had never recognized. In the university lecture hall, I set up my presentation. Dr. Sharma sat in the front row, offering me a small, encouraging smile. The room slowly filled with students, their faces a mixture of curiosity and intellectual ambition, reminding me so much of myself just a few years ago. 6 months ago, I began, the first slide appearing on the screen behind me, a stark, clinical X-ray of a human torso. I was a patient in an emergency room, not a designer. These images tell a story. Not just a story of physical trauma, but a story of silence. Of how a family's unspoken rules and a home's beautiful facade can conceal a deeply unsafe structure. I clicked through the slides, my voice steady. I explained each fracture, each healed break, not in medical terms, but in architectural ones. I spoke of repeated stress, of compromised integrity, of load-bearing walls that were never meant to take that kind of punishment. As designers, I told them, we have a profound responsibility. We create the spaces where people live, work, and heal. We must consider not just the physical shelter, but the psychological shelter a space provides. We are often the first line of defense for creating a world that feels safe. After the lecture, a young woman with bright, earnest eyes approached me. "Your talk," she said, her voice quiet. "It made me think about a women's shelter I'm volunteering at. The intake rooms are so cold and clinical. I think I know how to make them better now." "Trust your instincts," I told her, my heart swelling with a purpose I had never expected to find. Listen to the stories the spaces tell you. That evening, I returned to the apartment I now shared with Lena, a place I had started to think of as home. It was small, the floors creaked, and the plumbing was temperamental, but it was mine. It was safe. An envelope was waiting for me, the handwriting instantly recognizable as my mother's. They wrote occasionally, hesitant letters filled with regret, and the clumsy language of people just learning to take accountability. I didn't always read them. Tonight I did. Dear Clara, my mother had written. Your father and I saw an article online about your guest lecture. We know we have no right to say this, but we are so proud of the woman you have become. Your courage has forced us to look at our own profound cowardice, at the ways we failed you when you needed us most. We are so deeply, deeply sorry. I folded the letter, placing it on the counter. Their journey was theirs to walk. My burden was no longer their guilt, but my own future. I was building a new life, one where my voice had weight, where my experiences could illuminate the path for others, where the truth no longer had to be a secret kept in a dark basement. On my drafting table, a fresh sheet of vellum was taped down, waiting. It was a personal project, a small, simple design for a cottage. A place with wide windows to let in the light and a foundation sunk deep into solid ground. The X-rays that had once exposed my family's secrets were now a symbol of my own resilience. They had spoken a truth louder than any lie, broken a silence that had spanned decades, and in doing so, had given me back the most essential tool of my trade, the power to build. Lena had left a container of soup in the fridge with a note stuck to the lid. Remember, you're not just surviving anymore. You're thriving. Looking around at the peaceful, quiet light of my new life, I picked up a pencil and smiled. She was right. The lines I was drawing now were all my own.